Echoes of the Undying. Part 1. The Weight of a Second Chance. Chapter 1. The Last Breath. The abyss had no mercy for the living. Cale Dawnborn understood this better than anyone. He had spent 34 years carving his name into the bones of dungeons that swallowed lesser men whole, earning a title that made monsters hesitate before they charged. The Graveless One. The hunter who refused to die no matter how many times the darkness tried to claim him. But tonight, darkness had finally learned patience. The throne room of the 9th Black Dungeon smelled of iron and something older, something that predated human civilization, predated the mana catastrophe, predated every war and every prayer ever whispered by a frightened soldier before a hopeless charge. The walls breathed. Cale could feel it in his teeth, that slow, rhythmic pulse, like being swallowed by something enormous and simply not yet dead. His sword arm hung useless at his side. 3 fingers on his left hand were gone. He hadn't noticed when it happened. One moment he'd been fighting through the 47th wave of elite shadow constructs, creatures built from compressed darkness and the crystallized grief of everyone who had ever died in this place. And the next moment his hand was simply less. The wound didn't bleed the way normal wounds bled. The mana here was so dense, so ancient, that it cauterized injuries before you could mourn them. His body had learned to stop feeling certain things a long time ago. That was the price of his gift. Berserker's Covenant, the ability that made him legendary, the power that emptied him of everything soft and human in exchange for something unstoppable. The more damage he took, the stronger he became. The closer to death, the brighter he burned. But even fire, given enough darkness, eventually went cold. Behind him, what remained of his team lay scattered like broken toys. Rennis the Shield Weaver, 41 years old, father of 3. He had taken a hit meant for Cale 6 hours ago and hadn't complained once, even as the shadow poison worked through his bloodstream. He died facing the wall because he didn't want the others to see his expression. Toll and Mira, twin trackers from the northern clans. They had survived 11 black dungeons together. This was their 12th. They went down holding hands, back to back, the way they'd always said they wanted to go if it came to it. Old Brecht, the potion master, who always smelled faintly of pine resin and who made terrible jokes at the worst possible moments. He had given Cale his last 3 elixirs without being asked, and then picked up a broken sword and walked into a wall of shadow constructs so the others could breathe for 30 more seconds. Cale had counted every second. He was good at that, counting, surviving, pushing forward when every cell in his body screamed retreat. Now he stood before the sovereign of the 9th Abyss, and the counting had finally stopped. The entity had no shape he could properly describe. It existed the way a concept exists, not as a physical thing, but as a fact about the universe that the universe had somehow gotten wrong. It was vast and patient and completely, utterly indifferent. Cale had faced hundreds of monsters. He had stared down creatures that drove other men mad just by looking at them. But this was different. This thing didn't want to kill him. It simply was. And his existence in proximity to it was an error that would be corrected. A limb, something like a limb, descended from the ceiling of the throne room. It didn't move fast. It didn't need to. Cale raised his remaining good arm. Blue fire erupted from his palm, pouring from some reserve he hadn't known he still possessed. The mana hit the descending appendage and scattered like water thrown against stone. Useless. He knew it was useless. He threw it anyway because the alternative was standing still, and Cale Dawnborn had never, in 34 years of living, chosen to stand still. The impact came. It wasn't pain. Pain was too small a word for what happened to his body when the Sovereign's attention fully arrived. It was more like being rewritten, like someone had found the document of his existence and selected all and pressed delete. He fell. The cold stone of the throne room floor pressed against his cheek. He could see, at the extreme edge of his failing vision, the crack in the wall where Rennis had died. Just a crack. Just a wall. But Cale found himself staring at it with extraordinary focus because it was something real and small and human in a place that contained nothing else like it. This is it, he thought. 34 years. Not enough. It had never felt like enough. There were always more dungeons, more monsters pouring through the cracks in the world's skin, more people who needed someone to stand between them and the dark. Cale had never been able to explain why he kept going back, why he couldn't hang up the sword and live some quiet life the way his handlers kept suggesting. He knew now, in this last moment, what the real answer was. His parents had died when he was 7. Catastrophe, a horde event that swallowed their entire district in 45 minutes. Cale had survived because his mother had hidden him in a cellar and told him not to make a sound no matter what he heard above him. He had heard everything. And then, for 27 years, he had been trying to make sure no child ever sat in a dark cellar listening to the world end above them. He had failed more times than he'd succeeded, but he had tried. God, he had tried. I'm sorry, he thought, to no one, to everyone. He closed his eyes. 0. The voice came from behind him, from the direction of the crack in the wall. Cale's eyes opened. She was crouched beside him. Her healer's robes were destroyed, burned away in some battle he hadn't witnessed, replaced with ash and determination. Her hands were pressed against his chest, and they were glowing with the most extraordinary light he had ever seen. Not mana, not exactly. Something more. Lyra, he said. His voice came out as something between a word and a breath. You're supposed to be dead. I watched you. Shut up, she said. Her voice was shaking. Her whole body was shaking, but her hands didn't move. Quote 4. She was crying. He hadn't seen Lyra cry in 11 years of partnership. Not when they lost Renus, not when the twins went down. She had kept moving, kept healing, kept fighting, and he had thought she was simply stronger than the rest of them in that particular way. But now she was crying, and her hands were burning with golden fire, and the sovereign, the vast, ancient, indifferent thing that had just unmade most of him, had gone very still. What are you doing? Cale asked. Something I can't undo, she said, so you had better mean it this time. Mean what? Living. The light expanded. It swallowed the throne room, the crack in the wall, the memory of Renus's back and the twins' joined hands and Brecht's terrible jokes. It swallowed the sovereign. It swallowed 34 years of dungeons and blood and carefully maintained emotional distance and a boy sitting in a dark cellar listening to everything end. Then there was nothing. Then there was everything. Chapter 2. Smaller than he remembered. The first thing Cale noticed was that the ceiling was very close. The second thing he noticed was that someone was watching him. He turned his head, carefully, because his neck felt strange, too short, proportioned wrong, and found a girl staring at him from approximately half a meter away. She had his mother's eyes and a gap in her front teeth and an expression of such concentrated hope that it hit him somewhere under his ribs with the force of a physical blow. "You're awake," she said. He tried to answer. What came out was not words. The girl's expression dissolved into pure joy, and she launched herself at him with the full aerodynamic commitment of a 7-year-old child who has been waiting for something for a very long time. She hit him mid-chest and wrapped both arms around him and squeezed. __quote _11 _____. A woman appeared in the doorway. Warm face, dark hair going gray at the temples. Mother. The word arrived in Cale's mind with the blunt force of a forgotten memory suddenly remembered. He just woke up. Give him room to breathe. He has lots of room, Ilara said confidently. I'm not very big. Cale looked at his hands. They were small, both of them. All 10 fingers present and accounted for, unmarked by any scar, uncalloused, the hands of someone who had never held a weapon in his life. He was an infant. No, not quite. He could move, could think, could process. He was perhaps a year old, perhaps less, old enough to sit up with assistance, young enough that the world was still operating under the assumption that he had no inner life worth consulting. He looked at his mother's face. She was alive. He looked at his sister's gap-toothed smile pressed against his shoulder. She was alive. 34 years of dungeons and blood and the specific weight of grief that never quite leaves settled into the back of his mind like sediment. He let them settle. Then he made a decision. Never again. Not them. Not ever again. He raised one small, soft, ridiculous infant hand and placed it very carefully on top of Ilara's head. She pulled back to look at him, surprised. He didn't have the motor control to smile properly yet, but he tried. Chapter 3. Inventory. Cale Dawnborn had returned to the body of a child with 34 years of accumulated knowledge and exactly 0 useful upper body strength. He spent his first week cataloging what he had. Memory. Intact. Every dungeon, every strategy session, every dead companion's last words, every monster weakness he'd learned through painful trial and more painful error. All of it was there, organized with the particular brutal efficiency of someone who had spent decades treating his own mind as a survival tool. Mana. Present. This was the surprise. He'd expected to start from nothing, a clean slate, the thin trickle of power that most children developed around age 4 or 5. Instead, he could feel it coiled in his chest like something compressed and waiting, far denser than it had any right to be. His gift had followed him back. Berserker's Covenant was dormant. He didn't have the physical infrastructure to channel it yet, but it was there, waiting. The world outside changed, but not unrecognizably. The mana catastrophe had still happened. The barriers between human civilization and monster territory still held, barely, in most places. The governing bodies, the Mana Control Consortium, the 6 Pillars, the various clan alliances, still existed, though several of them were younger and differently aligned than in his memory. He was perhaps 15 years before the point where his first memory began. 15 years. He could do a great deal in 15 years if he wasn't spending most of it underground. His family's house was modest, but solid. His father worked materials engineering for a mid-tier infrastructure company, building the mana-conducting conduits that powered the city's barrier systems. His mother ran a small apothecary from the ground floor. Ilara was 7 and had already demonstrated what Cale recognized as early-stage resonant sensitivity, the ability to feel mana in other living things, which was either the foundation of an extraordinary healing gift or would develop into something stranger and more powerful. He began, quietly, with Ilara. She thought they were playing games. He let her think that. He would hold out his hand and she would reach for it, and he would very gradually, very carefully, let small amounts of mana flow between them, teaching her to feel the texture of it, the weight, the way it responded to intent rather than force. Her eyes would go wide every time. She called it tickling on the inside. Again, she'd say. He did. By the time he was 3 years old, Ilara could sustain a passive mana sense field for 11 minutes without concentration. She didn't know that was exceptional. He didn't tell her. He just kept playing. Chapter 4. The First Assessment. When Cale was 4, his father took him to the District Assessment Center, standard procedure in the post-catastrophe world. All children between 4 and 6 were evaluated for mana sensitivity, gift manifestation, and potential threat classification. The last category existed because roughly 1 in 800 children demonstrated either uncontrolled mana discharge sufficient to cause property damage or early signs of resonance with monster-type energies. These children weren't harmed. They were simply monitored more closely. The world had learned, the hard way, that early intervention was considerably less tragic than the alternative. The assessment center was a long, low building that smelled of antiseptic and institutional anxiety. Cale sat on a chair sized for someone half his apparent age. They always made the chairs too small, he was already observing, and watched the assessor, a tired woman in her 50s named Dr. Yen, run through her standard protocol. She held up a mana-sensitive crystal and asked him to try pushing his energy into it. He pushed exactly as much as he wanted her to see. The crystal lit up, pleasantly. A soft, gold-white glow consistent with above-average sensitivity, manageable output, no irregularities. Dr. Yen made a note. Gift classification, resonant. Projected development, upper tier standard. Recommended monitoring level, standard. She gave him a lollipop. He accepted it gravely. In the waiting room afterward, his father crouched down to his level with that particular parental expression that Cale had only ever seen from the outside looking in, concerned and proud simultaneously, trying to read a face he'd made himself. His father asked, Cale said. Cale considered the question with the full weight of a man who had faced the sovereign of the ninth abyss and knew what it felt like when existence itself tried to correct you. He said. His father laughed, surprised a little, and ruffled his hair. Cale let him, stored the feeling somewhere deep and protected it. Chapter 5. What he knew was coming. The night after the assessment, Cale sat on the edge of his small bed and did what he'd been putting off. He thought about the timeline. In his memory, in the history he'd lived through, the years ahead contained the following in rough order. The Thornwall collapse, a barrier failure in the Eastern District that would kill approximately 300 civilians and 24 players over the course of 6 hours before the gap was sealed. This happened when he was 7 in his current reckoning. The Deepwater emergence, a Class II sea entity that surfaced in the harbor and was eventually driven off by the combined effort of 4 of the 6 pillars. 31 deaths, permanent destruction of the old port district. This happened when he was 9. The Long Winter, a 2-year period of dramatically elevated monster activity across the entire continent, driven by something none of the mana researchers at the time had properly understood. Cale, having spent years in dungeons, had eventually pieced together the truth. A resonance cascade in the deep mana layers, set off by the construction of the consortium's grand conduit network. The engineers had built something beautiful and accidentally built something dangerous at the same time. The Long Winter killed more people than any event since the original catastrophe. It would begin when he was 11, and then there was the thing that happened when he was 6. The thing he couldn't think about directly without something in his chest going very tight and very cold. His parents had died in a monster incursion during the chaos surrounding the Thornwall collapse. They hadn't been anywhere near the collapse site. They'd been traveling to visit his mother's family in the next district when a redirected horde event caught the road they were on. Ilara had survived. She'd been at home with a fever. Cale, in his original timeline, had been in the cellar again. Different cellar, same situation. He'd spent the following years raised by an elderly neighbor who did her best and died before he was 12. He had never blamed her. He had never blamed anyone. He had simply learned to move forward, and he had never stopped moving. But he was not moving forward this time. He was here. He was early. He had 15 years of advance warning and 34 years of combat experience packed into a 4-year-old body that was, admittedly, becoming more capable than it had any right to be at this age, and he was not going to sit in another cellar listening to the world end. He would stop the Thornwall collapse, or, failing that, and he was honest enough with himself to maintain the possibility of failure, he would make absolutely certain his family was somewhere else when it happened. He closed his eyes. "I'm coming back for you," he told the memory of Lyra's golden light. "I'm going to fix it. All of it. Every piece I can reach." He didn't know if she could hear him, wherever she was in the grand architecture of what came after. He figured it couldn't hurt to say it anyway. Part 2. The Shape of Things to Come. Chapter 6. Sable District Elementary. The school smelled like chalk dust and institutional cooking and the low-frequency anxiety of 40 small people being sorted by society for the first time. Cale sat in the back row by the window and observed. His teacher was a young man named Mr. Karras, who had clearly entered the profession with significant idealism that was being slowly worn away by the reality of classroom management. He was kind in the way that people are kind when they're also tired, genuinely, but at reduced capacity. Cale liked him. His classmates were more interesting. 4th seat from the left in the 2nd row, a small girl with red-framed glasses and ink on 3 of her fingers, and the particular kind of frown that meant she was working on a problem nobody had asked her to solve. Her name was Sora. She would become, in Cale's original timeline, one of the most significant mana theorists of the next generation, a researcher whose work on deep-layer resonance cascades would eventually explain the Long Winter a decade too late. He needed to find a way to have a conversation with her about that research approximately 9 years earlier than it had originally happened. He made a note. 5th seat from the left, back row, directly beside him, a boy named Darrow who was already twice the size of every other child in the class and who sat with the careful stillness of someone who had learned early that larger people were expected to have smaller emotions. He was watching the other children with the same quiet attention Cale was. Their eyes met briefly. Darrow gave him a small nod. Cale returned it. Good instincts, he thought. At the front of the room, a girl named Petra was explaining to Mr. Karras, with complete confidence and zero awareness that this was not how classrooms worked, that she had already done the homework for the next 3 months, and could she please have something more interesting to do? Mr. Karras was handling this with admirable composure. Cale watched Petra with particular attention. In his original timeline, Petra had been recruited at age 12 by the Midnight Accord, a faction that operated in the gray space between the legitimate player guilds and something considerably darker. Not because she was malicious, because she was bored, and the Midnight Accord was the first organization that gave her genuinely interesting problems to solve. She'd spent 15 years serving an organization that used her considerable gifts to, among other things, deliberately suppress research that would have shortened the long winter by 6 months. Roughly 40,000 deaths worth of suppression. Cale had met her once, briefly, near the end of his career. She'd been quiet and careful and clearly aware that she had spent her gifts badly. He'd never been able to determine if she'd known what she was working toward. He watched her argue with Mr. Karras about the curriculum and thought, not this time. After class, he caught up with her at the water fountain. The homework is wrong, he said. Petra turned and looked at him with the expression of someone who has been told something interesting and is trying to determine if the source is credible. Which part? Problem 7, the mana flow calculation. They're using the old model, the one that treats mana as uniform. It's not, it pools. The equation only works if you account for density variance. She stared at him. He stared back. How do you know that? She asked. I read a lot, he said, which was true. He had read a very great deal, across a very long life, and none of it had arrived in the correct order. Petra looked at him for another long moment, then pulled out her workbook and looked at problem 7. Her expression went through several stages. Oh, she said. Oh, yeah, you're right. They're using the uniform model. She looked up. Do you want to figure out the correct version together? Yes, Cale said. This was how he made his first friend of this new life, by being honest about mathematics. He thought Lyra would have found that funny. Chapter 7, The Girl in the Garden. There was a garden behind the school that nobody used in winter. Cale used it every lunch period because it was empty and quiet and he could practice. He was 5 now. His body was more cooperative. The motor control he'd been carefully building through deliberate physical training had started to compound, the way skills do when the foundation is solid. He could channel mana through his hands with something approaching precision. Not the precision of his adult self. That would take years of physical infrastructure to rebuild. But enough. He was working on a new skill, something he hadn't had in his original life. The Sovereign of the Ninth Abyss, in the last moment before Lyra's golden light swallowed everything, had done something to him. He'd felt it distantly, through the fog of his collapse, a transference, some quality of that vast ancient entity pressing itself into him like a seal pressed into wax. He didn't know what it was yet. He could feel it in the back of his mana sense like a locked room, and every time he pressed against it, something pressed back. He was being careful. __quote _31 __. Cale turned around. A girl was sitting on the garden wall. She had dark, braided hair and a healer's satchel over one shoulder that was considerably too large for her, and a direct, assessing gaze that reminded him uncomfortably of Lyra. You don't go to this school, he said. My school shares the lunch break, she said. I like this garden. You're new here. She paused. You're doing it wrong, the mana cycling. You're running it in a closed loop instead of through your meridians. It'll damage the pathways eventually. Cale looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his hands. Then back at her. You can see mana flow? I can feel it. She hopped off the wall with the ease of someone who had been climbing things her whole life. My name is Vera. What's yours? Cale. You have a lot of mana for someone your age. She didn't say it with envy or alarm, just observation. She tilted her head. He considered her. Sora had ink-stained fingers and solved problems nobody asked her to solve. Petra challenged authority through sheer intellectual confidence. Darrow watched everything with quiet, careful eyes. and Vera had walked into a winter garden, identified a flaw in his mana-cycling technique, and asked him a direct question without any particular agenda beyond curiosity. He thought about who she might become, with or without intervention. He thought about Lyra's golden light and the way she'd held his dying body and said, "You had better mean it this time." __quote _43 ___, he said, which was technically true from a certain perspective. Vera sat down on the ground across from him, cross-legged, with no hesitation. And that was how he made his second friend. Chapter 8. Before the Wall Falls. 2 weeks before the Thornwall collapse, Cale began his preparations. He was 6 years old. He had been working toward this moment for approximately 2 years of careful infrastructure building, cultivating information networks among the children of engineers and administrators whose parents talked about work at dinner, slowly building a pattern recognition system for monster movement that any single player would have dismissed as coincidence, but that he, with 34 years of dungeon experience, recognized as the beginning stages of a directed horde assembly. The Thornwall collapse, he had determined, was not purely an engineering failure. It was partly engineered. Not by the monsters, they lacked that kind of coordination. By a human actor who had reasons to want chaos in the Eastern District during a specific 6-hour window. He didn't have the full picture yet. He had pieces, but the immediate problem wasn't the conspiracy. It was the wall. He needed the wall to hold, or, failing that, he needed to redirect the Horde event so it went somewhere uninhabited instead of through 300 civilian casualties and his parents' travel route. He had one significant asset, Mr. Karras. Mr. Karras's brother worked barrier maintenance for the Eastern District Authority. Mr. Karras had mentioned this exactly once, 3 months ago, when explaining to the class why they should appreciate infrastructure workers. Cale had been paying attention. He found Mr. Karras after school on a Thursday, Cale said. Mr. Karras looked at him with the patient expression of a teacher who has heard many things described as important by 6-year-olds. Mr. Karras had gone very still. He said slowly, "Quote 51, quote 52, Cale said. Quote 53, quote." He held Mr. Karras's gaze steadily, the way he'd once held the gaze of dungeon bosses 3 times his size, and said nothing else. Mr. Karras called his brother that evening. The brother, who had been planning to run a routine check of sections 5 through 10 the following week, moved the 7B inspection forward. He found 3 corroded junction dampers and a stress fracture in the primary conduit housing. The repair team worked for 6 days straight. They finished with 4 days to spare before the storm. When the weather event hit, and it was severe, worse than the forecasters had projected, a full mana storm that would have sent load spikes through every barrier system in the district, the eastern wall held. It held, and the horde that had been assembling in the shadow of it, waiting for the gap, found no gap. Found instead a wall that refused to break. Scattered in confusion and was driven back by the player response teams who arrived while the horde was still disorganized. 300 lives did not end that day. Cale sat on the school wall and looked at the eastern skyline where the storm was breaking over the intact barrier, and he thought about a boy in a cellar, and he thought about his mother's face, and he let out a breath that had been held somewhere for 34 years. Then he went home for dinner. Ilara stole his bread. His father complained about the news coverage of the storm. His mother asked if he'd had a good day. Quote 54, quote, he said. Quote 55, quote. Part 3. What Remains. Chapter 9. The Network. By the time Cale was 8 years old, he had assembled something that didn't have a name yet. He thought of it privately as the Archive, a network of children, now growing into early adolescence, who shared certain qualities: exceptional ability, unconventional thinking, and a willingness to ask questions that adults had decided were too complicated to be worth asking. Sora worked on deep-layer mana theory. Petra had redirected her considerable intellect from whatever the Midnight Accord would have offered her toward actual mana systems research. Darrow had turned out to have a gift for structural force work that made him invaluable, and that he applied with the same quiet, careful competence he applied to everything. Vera's healing sense had developed into something extraordinary. She could identify mana pathway abnormalities before they caused symptoms, which was either going to make her one of the great healers of her generation or the target of significant institutional interest. Other members had joined along the way. A girl named Fen, who could process information at a speed that bordered on inhuman and who had an encyclopedic knowledge of monster behavioral patterns. A boy named Crispin, who had no apparent gift at all, but who was so extraordinarily good at talking to people that he served as the group's unofficial diplomat and information gatherer. None of them knew why Cale knew the things he knew. He'd cultivated careful cover stories. He read extensively. He had a naturally analytical mind. He was good at pattern recognition. These things were all true. They simply didn't explain quite how extensive the pattern recognition was. He was particularly careful with Vera. She had a tendency to look at him with that direct, assessing gaze and say things like, "You're doing that thing again where you know something but you're deciding whether to say it," and then wait, with infinite patience, for him to decide. He'd gotten better at deflecting. She'd gotten better at waiting. He suspected sometimes that she had her own secrets. She deflected certain questions about her family with the same practiced ease he brought to questions about his knowledge base. He didn't push. He figured when it mattered, they'd both say what needed saying. The archive met twice a week in Sora's family's storage room, which Sora's mother had optimistically designated A_quote_57_, and which now contained 4 whiteboards, a disturbing amount of mana theory literature, and a stolen institutional coffee maker that Crispin had acquired through means none of them had inquired into. They were working that autumn on the long winter, Sora said. She had a new pair of glasses, round instead of rectangular, and the ink on her fingers had migrated to her forearms. Cale said. Everyone looked at him, he said. Silence. Sora said quietly. Cale confirmed. More silence. Fen asked. Cale said. Sora said. She looked at him steadily. Petra's voice was careful. She had a way of being careful that was very different from how most people were careful. Not hesitant, but precise, like she was measuring the space between words. What are you actually trying to do? He looked at all of them. Their faces, young still, but sharpened by years of working on problems too large for children, by the specific gravity of taking things seriously before the world expected them to. He made a decision. The long winter kills 100,000 people, he said. In the next 6 years, we can prevent it. Not by stopping the consortium's project. We're 8 years old. We can't stop a government infrastructure project. But by ensuring the integration happens during a trough cycle instead of a peak cycle, we can reduce the harmonic interference to manageable levels. He paused. The consortium will listen to Sora's research, not to us, but to her research. If she publishes it in the right place, at the right time, with the right framing. I'm 9, Sora said. Your analysis is correct regardless of your age. The journals won't accept a paper from a 9-year-old. No, but they'll accept one from your mother's research supervisor, if she brings it to his attention. He looked at Sora, which she will when you show her your work. Sora was quiet for a long moment. You're planning 6 years out. I'm planning as far out as I can see, he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said in years. Darrow spoke from the back of the room, where he'd been listening with his arms crossed. Why us? He asked. Why this group? Why all of this? He paused, and his voice was careful in the way Cale recognized. Not accusatory, just precise. You found all of us. You approached us first, every time. You had a reason. Yes, Cale said. Are you going to tell us what it is? Cale thought about Lyra's golden light. He thought about Renus facing the wall. He thought about the specific weight of a cellar door and what it meant to be the person who came back when everyone else was gone. Quote 89, quote, he said. Quote 90, quote. Darrow nodded, accepted this because he understood, in the way that only people who also carry things they haven't said understand, that when it's time was sometimes the only promise worth making. Chapter 10. The Thing in the Locked Room. The night before Cale's 9th birthday, the locked room opened. He was practicing mana cycling alone in the garden when he felt it, the presence at the back of his awareness, the thing the Sovereign had pressed into him in that last moment, pressing back with greater force than usual. He stopped moving, stopped breathing, waited. It opened like a slow exhalation. What the sovereign had given him was not power, not exactly. It was more like perspective, the capacity to perceive mana on a scale so vast that most human minds would have collapsed trying to process it. He could feel, suddenly and overwhelmingly, the deep layer pulses Sora had been theorizing about. Could feel them the way you feel your own heartbeat, automatic, constant, baseline. And he could see, with a clarity that was genuinely terrifying, the shape of the cascade that the consortium's timeline was building toward. Sora had been right. He had been right. But it was worse than either of their models had projected. Not 100,000 deaths. More. Much more if the integration happened at the wrong moment. He sat very still in the garden for a long time. Then he went inside, sat at his desk, and wrote 17 pages of supplementary analysis that he would give to Sora in the morning. It would take her 3 weeks to verify it. When she did, her face went the particular shade of pale that meant the numbers were right and she wished they weren't. "We need more time," she said. "I know," Kale said. "We have 5 years. It's enough." Is it? He thought about what enough meant. He thought about what he was doing and why, and the long chain of reasons stretching back to a cellar, to 34 years of dungeons, to a woman with golden hands and tears on her face. "Yes," he said, "we're going to make it enough." Chapter 11. What Vera Knew. 3 months before Kale turned 10, Vera told him the truth. They were in the garden, his garden now, essentially, the place he'd claimed by consistent occupation, and she sat across from him with her healer's satchel in her lap and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze he'd grown accustomed to over 4 years and said, quote, Kale kept his face very still. She said. She paused, choosing words carefully. She looked at him. Kale was quiet for a long moment. He thought about all the things he'd kept carefully managed, the cover stories, the deliberate limitations on what he demonstrated, the art of knowing things for reasons he couldn't explain and presenting those things as conclusions he'd reasoned his way to. He thought about Darrow's question, why us, and his answer, when it's time. How long have you known? He asked. Since the 3rd week, she said. The day you showed me mana compression in the garden. You corrected my technique and it was like being corrected by someone who had been doing it for decades. The micro adjustments, the precision. Nobody learns those things from books. I read a very great deal. I know you do. That's not what this is. She waited. I'm not afraid of it. I want you to know that. Whatever it is, I'm not afraid. He looked at her. She was 9. She had dark braided hair and a healer's satchel and an extraordinary gift and 4 years of patience that he had, he realized, absolutely relied on. Quote, he said. He paused, found words for it. She nodded, absorbed this. She said, quote, she listened, she said quietly. She looked at him. He said, Shrum us. He noticed her saying us and felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been very carefully held in place for a long time, starting to relax. She thought about Lyra, about golden light, and you had better mean it this time. About grief stored in a locked room and opened only when necessary. Quote 25 he said. Vera was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. It was the nod of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and has found someone to help hold it. And she did it with no drama and no ceremony and exactly the right amount of solemnity. Quote, she said. Chapter 12. The Years Between. The years that followed were quieter than Kale had expected. He had anticipated constant crisis. The world he remembered had never quite stopped burning, one emergency folding into the next, the dungeon cycle relentless. But he had forgotten, or perhaps never properly experienced the first time, what it was like to live in the spaces between catastrophes. To go to school, to eat dinner with his family, to watch Ilara grow from a gap-toothed 7-year-old into a sharp-witted teenager whose monosense had developed into a full resonance gift that drew quiet professional attention. He had forgotten, too, what it meant to have friends. Not companions in the dungeon sense, people you trusted with your life because the alternative was dying, but actual friends, people who knew your habits and your irritating quirks and made fun of you for them. Petra had appointed herself his personal critic and chronicled every time he said something so precisely analytical that it came out accidentally insulting. Darrow had developed the habit of silently appearing beside him whenever anything stressful was happening, without comment, just present. Sora brought him copies of papers she found interesting with specific passages underlined and question marks in the margins that were only technically questions. Crispin had, at some point, decided Cale's social calibration needed ongoing improvement and took this as a personal mission, with the same commitment he brought to everything. And Vera knew. It changed something between them. Not into something awkward, but into something with more room in it, like a wall becoming a window. She never treated him as though he were old. She never made him feel like the 34 years in his chest were a burden she was tolerating. She simply talked to him the way she talked to anyone she considered worth talking to, directly, honestly, with the full assumption that he could handle whatever she had to say. He found, over time, that he had become very attached to that. He didn't examine this too closely. He was 11. There were other things to focus on. Sora's research, refined through 2 years of additional work with the supplementary analysis Cale had provided, had been noticed by her mother's research supervisor, who had initially been skeptical and then extremely not skeptical, and who had published a joint paper under his name with Sora, credited as primary analytical contributor. The Mana research community had been quietly disrupted. The consortium's technical advisory board had requested a briefing. The long winter's probability had been dropping in Cale's deep perception estimates for 6 months. The deep water emergence was still coming. He had not been able to prevent it. The entity's movements were too unpredictable, the harbor district too large, the player response infrastructure too locked into protocols he couldn't influence from his current position. He had, however, spent the previous year systematically mapping the harbor district's evacuation routes and quietly identifying 3 bottlenecks that he'd managed to get flagged to the Civil Planning Office through Crispin's considerable social skills. When the emergence happened, the evacuation ran 12 minutes faster than it had in his memory. 17 people who had died in his original timeline went home to their families that day. He counted. He always counted. Part 4. The Reckoning. Chapter 13. What the locked room was really holding. The summer Cale turned 12, he went into his first dungeon. Not because he needed to. He was 12, which was young, but not impossibly young for a probationary assessment. With his demonstrated mana output and the technical skills he'd cultivated, the consortium's junior evaluation track had been approaching his family for 2 years about formal assessment. He'd put them off. Now, with the immediate crises managed and the long winter prevention on a stable trajectory, he decided it was time. The dungeon was Class 6, a forest type inhabited by shadow wolves and a Tier 2 construct guardian. Child's play by his previous standards. He went in with a certified junior evaluator and 3 other assessment candidates. It took him 4 minutes and 30 seconds. The evaluator had difficulty writing his report afterward because the official framework contained no category for what she had witnessed. Quote, she said, when it was over and they were back in the staging area. He said, she looked at him steadily. He looked back. He had 34 years of dungeon experience and the patience of someone who had waited a very long time for a great many things. Quote 131 she said finally, and made notes. But the dungeon had done something unexpected. When he'd stepped into the shadow wolf pack, that familiar smell, the particular heaviness of dungeon air, the way combat narrowed the world to geometry and timing, the Sovereign's gift had activated for the first time in a combat context. Not the perception expansion, something else, something that had been waiting in the locked room alongside the perception, folded behind it. He'd felt, very clearly, the moment when his own deep mana reserves shifted. Not burning. He hadn't burned through his reserves in years, far too careful for that. But the gift had recognized the dungeon environment and responded, and for approximately 30 seconds, he had accessed a level of mana clarity and precision that was considerably beyond what his 12-year-old physical infrastructure should have been able to channel. It hadn't hurt. It had felt like something clicking into place. He spent 3 days after the assessment sitting very quietly in his room, thinking about what the Sovereign had given him and why. He came to a conclusion that was, he recognized, either correct or the most dangerous thing he'd ever believed. The sovereign hadn't been giving him a gift. It had been returning something. Something that had been his, some quality of his original berserker gift, extracted and compressed and handed back with the patience of something that existed on geological timescales. The berserker's covenant didn't work the way it had in his original life. It wouldn't, not with this body's different foundation. But it had left something behind, some residue, some shape of what he'd been. And the sovereign had been preserving it, waiting for him to grow into something that could hold it. He would need it for what was coming. Not the long winter. That was almost managed. Something else. Something his original timeline hadn't survived long enough to face properly. He'd seen the edges of it in dungeon records, ancient records, pre-catastrophe, describing an entity that moved in 17-year cycles. Something that had been sleeping in the deepest layer of all when the mana catastrophe happened, and had been, very slowly, waking up ever since. He was 12. He had approximately 5 years. Chapter 14. The Full Accounting. Kale told them everything on a Tuesday evening in November. They were all in Sora's storage room. Not children anymore, exactly, though not quite what the world would call adults. 12 and 13, sharp and tired and capable in ways that had cost them something of ordinary childhood, though none of them, as far as Kale could tell, resented that cost. He told them about his original life. He told them about 34 years of dungeons and the names of the people he'd lost along the way, and what the Sovereign of the Ninth Abyss was, and what Lyra had done, and how he'd found himself in a body that didn't match his memories and decided to try to fix the things he could reach. He told them what was coming. Not the long winter, that they already knew. That was nearly handled. The deep sleeper, the entity the pre-catastrophe scholars had called the architect of ends, recorded in 3 separate ancient traditions as a recurring catastrophe that arrived, consumed, and departed on its own inscrutable schedule. In his original timeline, it had begun its waking cycle during the last years of his life. He'd felt it, that immense, slow pressure, like something enormous turning over, without understanding what it was. Now he understood. "We have 5 years," he said. "Possibly 6. The consortium needs to know. The 6 pillars need to be aligned. The player systems need a structural overhaul that nobody currently has the political will to implement." He paused. "I can't do this alone. I've never been able to do anything alone. I just refused to admit it for most of my first life." Silence. Then Petra said, with the careful precision she brought to everything, "You should have told us sooner." "Yes," he said. "We would have helped sooner. I know. You spent years managing everything at arm's length when you could have had actual support." She was not angry. She was stating facts, which was more devastating. "That's not efficiency. That's the same thing that got you killed." He thought about that for a moment. "Yes," he said again. "You're right." Vera was watching him with the direct assessing gaze that he had, over 3 years, learned to stop deflecting. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Darrow spoke from the back, arms crossed in the quiet, careful voice he used when he'd thought something through completely. Quote, 143, quote, he said. Kale said. He looked around the room. Sora, with her ink-stained forearms and her extraordinary mind already calculating. Petra, with her precise, dangerous intelligence aimed at the right things now. Darrow, unmovable and reliable as foundation stone. Fen, cataloging everything she heard with absolute retention. Crispin, already thinking about which conversations needed to happen with whom. Vera, who knew everything, watching him with the expression of someone who has decided to make something work and has no intention of reconsidering. He thought about Lyra's golden light, and you had better mean it this time. He thought about a boy in a cellar, listening. He thought about his mother at the dinner table, and Alara's gap-toothed smile, and his father's hand ruffling his hair, and 34 years of fighting alone, because he'd never known, never properly known, that you could fight differently. He said. Crispin pointed at himself with an expression of focused readiness. Darrow said. He said. He met her eyes. She said. He looked at all of them. He said. Fen said mildly, as if this was obvious. Sora said. He let out a breath. Petra said. Kale looked at all of them. He thought, distantly, of what it felt like to stand at the entrance to a dungeon, that moment before you went in, when you could still technically turn around. He'd never turned around, not once in 34 years. He'd never once had this, though, this specific weight of people in a room who knew what they were walking into and were choosing it anyway. Quote, 164, he said, and they began. Epilogue, What the Archive Builds. Cale Dawnborn, the graveless one, the man the dungeons couldn't keep, was 12 years old, sitting in a storage room that smelled of coffee and determination, surrounded by people who knew the truth about him and were still, somehow, choosing to stay. Outside, the city hummed with the ordinary sounds of ordinary life. His family would be home. Alara would have stolen whatever dessert their mother made. His father would complain about the news and then fall asleep during it. Small things, human things, things that had cost 34 years and an impossible return to get right. He had approximately 5 years before the deep sleeper fully woke. He had Sora's mind and Petra's precision and Darrow's steadiness and Fenn's memory and Crispin's gift for being human in all the ways Cale had forgotten how. He had Vera, who knew everything, and who had decided that knowing everything was not a reason to leave, but a reason to help. He had, for the first time in 2 lives, exactly the right people. It would be enough. He had decided to make it enough. The coffee maker gurgled. Sora uncapped a pen. Petra pulled out a model she'd been working on for weeks and spread it across the table. Vera closed her eyes, reaching with her sense into the deep layers of the city around them, mapping the pulse of the world's hidden heart. Cale picked up a pen. He thought, Lyra, I think I finally understand what you meant. He thought, I'll tell them the rest when it's time. I'll keep telling them. I won't stop. He looked at the blank page in front of him. He started writing. The archive will continue.